Hi everyone. So before we start creating our web APIs, it's a good idea to discuss some of the underlying basic concepts. For those who aren't aware, it would be a good refresher. So API leverage a concept of HTTP, and I'll explain that. So we can have a client and a server, and they have to communicate, right? So what happens is client sends a request, and then server can respond back to it via response, right? Now all of this is possible because of HTTP. So what happens is you create your APIs using the concepts of HTTP. HTTP is a communication protocol between client and a server. Client sends a request, and then server can send a response back. Now, HTTP have different verbs or actions. Now, these are get. Get is if there is a resource on a server and we want to get. So for that, there is a get request. Post if we want to uh, insert a new resource onto the server. For that, we use post. Put and patch is to update a resource, right? Delete is to delete, as the name suggests, delete a resource. Um, Now, with the request, there's an important concept called request. Sorry, there's an important concept called request header. So, and as well as response header. So, when the client sends the request to the when the client sends the request to the server, it can send a request header. Likewise, when the server send back the response, it sends the it it can potentially send back the response header. And then there is a specific concept related to the response, which is response status code. This can tell us like whether the response was successful. If and in 200 categories, response is successful. 400 is whether there was issue from the client side, and 500 whether there was an issue on the server side. Don't worry, we'll discuss this in detail in coming lessons. I think this series is enough. Let's move to Rider and see how we can create web APIs. Sorry, before that, let me just briefly talk about MVC pattern. So that's like a software architectural pattern used to create APIs. So the concept is you have something called model, there's your controller, and then there's your view. And this concept is relevant to server, not client. Okay. So what happens is a request, client sends a request, right? That goes to the controller, and then controller can access the model. This is where your data lies, and then the model sends back the data to the controller, and then the controller sends the response in the form of a view, and then that just goes back to the client. So the client sends the request to the controller. Controller interacts with the model. It gets the data. When it gets the data, it can send a response in a form of a view. In the context of web API, most likely it's going to be JSON. Although we can send other formats, but JSON is most likely going to be sent back to the client. In order to, yeah, so it's important to understand this workflow, and then you'll be easily now able to understand like how. All right, let's create our web API. Since we're creating a real estate web API, the model I have selected for this is we would have suburbs, and then attached to it would be some home listings. So each suburb would have some home listings, and the relationship between them would be like one to many. I'll start with the controllers. Let's add a suburbs controller, and I need to add an attribute API controller. Let's add some action method. I'm returning a JSON result, and I'm not creating my models. Let's just hard code this, uh, and then I can return a list of, let's say, object, because I'll be returning anonymous object inside this list because I don't have my model for now. Let's return something. Uh, I don't know. Let's add maybe 3 suburbs. Let me grab some suburb names from. I'm just picking some random suburb from Adelaide, right? All right, that's that. Now in order to make this work, I need to add the HTTP attribute, and then also I need to specify the route. So route for this can be something like API slash this. Let me run this. Right. It's running. Let me test the API from Postman. It's not found. All right, that was just some typo. So if I request again, I'm able to get that response, right? And I can create a environment variable for this, like port number here, and then I can come here and then add that port number, right? Something like that. So if I run this now, instead of hard coding this, if my port number changes, I'll just change it over here. Now, what you can also do is instead of specifying the route on each specific action method, it's better to specify a route here and then just remove the route from here. Um, Now, it's also better to name your controller like this. And then if it has the controller, what will happen is the controller will pick just the suburbs here. Um, let's test this again to see if it's working. So if I send a request again, yeah, and it's working, right? I can put a breakpoint and then show you that it's the same action method that's called, but I can do that maybe later. Now, obviously, we don't want to hard code our models in the controller and return like something like this. So to get rid of this, let's create models. So I'll create a new directory and call it models. And let's add our suburbs DTO. Uh, Now the thing is, API would interact with our DTOs, right? It's not the exact same underlying object which we would store in our data store. Those would be entities, and as we progress through, we'll discuss. So I can say its name. So I'm pretty much following the same structure what we used in our um, controller. So the idea is we will be replacing that DTO with this one. Maybe let's just add some more attributes like description, and then description is optional. We will discuss in detail the difference between DTOs and entities as we progress. But for now, let's just focus on the DTOs. Obviously, we need to we need a data store. So for now, I'm using in-memory data store. Later on, we'll convert this into a proper database using entity framework. Um, Let me just call this a suburbs data store. Again, let's just hard code some of those suburbs, but instead of in the controller, let's just isolate it here. So now let's use a singleton pattern, which means whenever this is called, I want this property to be already initialized. So for that, I need to hold let me call it as instance. So whenever I call this, let's just add a bunch of suburbs. Let me pick that from here, and let's just add in this data store, right? Um, the description was added as extra. Let's just add, I don't know, right? So what I've done here basically is whenever we call this, um, this suburb would be filled with this instance, and that's just a singleton pattern. Now let's go back to our controller. Instead of hard coding it, let's just use our singleton data store. So in the JSON result, let's just use that, what's it called? Suburb data store dot instance, and then suburbs, right? Let me run this and see if it works. So let's test our API. And yes, that's working. I mentioned earlier I can show you the we are hitting the same. So let me just again run the application, and then if I call the API, it hits the breakpoint. If I continue, I get the response, right? To summarize briefly what we have done so far, I created a controller first. Initially, what I did was inside the controller, I hard coded the data, but then we decided, okay, that's not the right approach. Let's just create a model. We created our model, and then I isolated the data into the model, and then to store the data, I've created like a separate data store which holds our model. Uh, we will make further improvements as we go. So what happens is then in the data store, we're using a singleton pattern, and then whenever we trying to access that um, in-memory data store in our controller, we just reference that static instance and then grab our suburbs. That's just normal singleton pattern. Let's just expand on this and write a different action method. So if I come here, right now, instead of just accessing all the suburb, I can not by air get suburb, and then just maybe using suburb ID, right? I can simply return a new instance of JSON result, and then I'm pretty much grabbing the same stuff. But once I've got the list of all suburb, I'm just using um, getting first or default, and then if they exist, I'll get the. Now I need to pass this parameter from the URI, and for that I can use get request, and in order to grab that ID, I'll have to make it parameterized. Let's just run the application again. So from my previous call, I know that ID2 is Fravel, or let's just grab Burnside. If I come here, let me see my application. Yeah, my application is started. So all I need to do is, since if you look at the URI, tail controller is the suburb, and then I just need to provide ID. So if I, for the sake of completeness, if I run this again, I'm getting all my suburbs. But if I just need an ID of 3, then I should be getting back null, which is not what I was expecting. Let me just have a look. What's the issue? All right, so I found out what the issue was. This happens when you use autocomplete a lot. So as you can see, my parameter is ID, but then I'm using something else, right? I think I should pick suburb ID. That makes more sense. Yeah, let me try again. So these are all my suburbs, but if I just want to get one of those, I can, let me try something which does not exist, like 5. So I'm getting null, right? How about if I try something which does not exist? For example, something like I get 404 not found, right? One more thing, later on we would need like lots of features from controller base, so it's a good idea to um, inherit from that. A quick note on status codes, such as this. So they are like different sorts of status codes, all the way ranging in 200, from 400, and then 500. So anything that has to do with 200, that means all good. And then you have 200, okay, 201, 204. I'm not going into that, but whatever is starting with 200, this means everything is good. Anything that starts with 400, this means there was issue, but the issue was on the client side. And then anything on 500, meaning there was an issue on the server side. So that's a higher level overview of like status codes. And then 200, and then 201 and 204. We'll discuss more specific as we go, but yeah, these are the main ones. Now, a while ago, I discussed that it's good to use controller base, and I'll come to that just in a minute. Um, but what if we want to change the status code? For instance, let's just come to this, and if I store this in, let's say, variable, and then if I come here and then status code, if I want to change it to 200, for instance, right now, or 200, but the thing is that's not a very good approach of dealing with status codes ourselves. That's why it's good idea to use action results, something. So instead of simply returning JSON result, it's better idea to return JSON. And then if I, over here, I'm returning single DTO, so I'll write, and then I can, so since I've used controller base, in the controller base, I have an method, and then I can just, right? And likewise, but here I am returning a list. I can say I enumerable of suburb DTO, right? And then instead of this, let me just, here as well, it will do the conversion itself, so I don't need to worry about that, right? One other thing, what if the ID I pass do not have, doesn't have any related suburb? So for that, what I can do is just grab, let's do some refactoring here. So if I grab this, I can call suburbs. And then if I, let's just, and then I'm checking if suburb, if suburb is null, then I don't want to return null. In fact, I want to return null, but with the status code of not found. But if it's found, then only I want to return, right? All right. Remember earlier I mentioned that our model is suburbs, and then also one suburb can have multiple home listings. So let me add another controller called home listings. Let's just create an ID. Um, let's say not name, but the address for the listing, and maybe let's say int asking price. What else? Let's say, I think that that should be sufficient. Now let's go and tie back the, sorry, I should put this into the models controller, models rather than controller, and then I should grab that here. Okay, sorry. Now let's establish that relationships. If I'm in the model, if I'm in the suburbs, one suburb can have multiple. So home listings, home listings, and that just, let's just new up by default. Let's say I also want to have a calculated property, which is, let's say, number home listings. Let's just maybe find the count, right? Now once that's done, let's also go and update our data. What home listings, and let's new up new home listing. Our model is getting a bit complex now, right? New, let's say home ID 1, address. I'll come to that in a minute. Asking price, let's say, I don't know. Oops. And let's some fill in some details, right? Let's say this home ID 2, address I can add on later, and then let me just remove one server so it's easy for me to put the details. All right. This home listing ID would be 3 and this is 4, right? Now let me change some of the details, or at least we can have some differences. This is 1.5. Let's just make this 2, this is 4, and this is 6. All right, let's test our API if it's still working, right? So we have now two suburbs because I removed one of them. Let me test. Yep, so we're getting all of our suburbs, including the home listing we just added. Now let's try just grabbing one, and yes, that's working. Now this controller is for suburbs. As you can see, we should have a separate controller for home listing if we want to add or just access the elements of the child resource. I think that's pretty much it. In the next tutorial, I'll add the controller for the home controller. For now, we'll just add some action methods, and in the future tutorials, I can add how we can update a resource, modify a resource, and things like that. Uh, there's a lot to cover, like authentication and adding entity framework core. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.